April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above the fields of northern France, an uneasy quiet hung beneath the blue. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A-5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermann watched unfamiliar silhouettes laboring upward, their forms slow and broad against the sky. The men in the German cockpits laughed. What else could they do? The new American fighter looked ungainly, a barrel-shaped mass with a greenhouse cockpit and a propeller that seemed too large for the airframe. Flying milk bottles, one pilot radioed. A joke, an insult, a dismissal. What none of them could know that morning was that they had seen, for the first time, a machine that would change the shape of Allied air power. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, loud, and at first dismissed, would become one of the most effective, durable, and destructive fighters of the Second World War. It would not win through elegance or nimbleness. It would win through power, protection, and production. This is the story of how industry became a weapon, and of how a flying juggernaut taught the world that numbers, logistics, and rugged engineering could decide the skies. The Thunderbolt story begins in the worst days of 1940. As German panzer columns and Luftwaffe formations swept across France, American aircraft designers watched and learned. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, received an urgent brief from the U.S. Army Air Corps: build a high-altitude interceptor that could meet the Luftwaffe's best. Kartveli's answer was not to produce a European-style light fighter optimized for climb and turn. He proposed something bigger, a heavy, powerful single-engine fighter built around the most advanced radial available, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. The XP-47B prototype first rose from the runway on May 6, 1941. It startled onlookers. With an empty weight near 9,900 pounds, it was far heavier than previous American single-engine designs. Its fuselage housed a massive turbocharger system whose ducting ran through the rear of the aircraft. It looked and sounded like an oddity. Pilots asked the same question: does this thing actually fly? It did more than fly. At altitude, the turbocharged R-2800 delivered sea-level power where other engines stuttered. The Thunderbolts designers had created an aircraft that traded agility for speed, survivability, and firepower. They built an armor-bolstered structure and a battery of 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. This was not a boutique fighter for racing dogfights. It was an industrial tool designed to survive and to inflict damage. Early testing revealed real problems. The P-47 was unforgiving on takeoff and landing. Its torque and mass caused ground handling accidents. Compressibility, shock effects at high speed, surprised pilots. Many died learning the aircraft. The Thunderbolt killed more American pilots in training through late 1942 than the Luftwaffe would claim in the first months of American combat. Yet those who mastered the machine discovered its hidden logic. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, likened his first flight to strapping onto a locomotive. "You didn't fly it so much as aim it," he later said. The airplane rewarded energy tactics, diving and using momentum rather than tight turns. And crucially, its radial engine and heavy structure offered survivability unseen in liquid-cooled fighters. On that April morning in 1943, 56 American pilots in Thunderbolts and supporting units were novices in combat. They had been trained in formation flying and gunnery, but they had not yet tested their machines against seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. The Germans had fought since 1939, Poland, France, Britain, the Eastern Front, and they believed their tactics were proven. When they met the Thunderbolt, initial encounters confirmed their prejudices. The P-47 could not outturn the nimble FW-190 in close dogfights, nor could it match the climb of a Bf-109 in some regimes. German pilots exploited these weaknesses, pressing turning engagements and attacking from angles that accentuated the Thunderbolt's supposed faults. But other things were happening in the sky that the German pilots did not yet appreciate. P-47s returned from missions time, and again bearing punishment that should have been fatal. Cases circulated of aircraft with dozens of holes, shattered canopies, torn cowlings, yet still flying home. The radial engine, air-cooled, not dependent on vulnerable coolant jackets, shrugged off small arms, and even cannon damage that would stop a Spitfire or a Bf-109. The structural strength of the airframe kept wings, fuselages, and control surfaces intact long enough to get pilots back to base. And when P-47s did hit, they hit hard. 8 heavy .50s firing at convergence produced a devastating probability cloud of rounds. With a standard load of roughly 425 rounds per gun, a Thunderbolt could sustain a long burst, enough time, at effective range, to tear an enemy aircraft apart. The Americans did not initially have the range for deep escort, but their concentrated firepower could rip into fighters and ground targets with terrifying effect. It was the velocity of fire and the ability to maintain it that the Luftwaffe had not confronted in similar measure. The first months of P-47 combat told a paradoxical story. Early losses and poor exchange rates suggested weakness, yet the raw survivability and firepower signaled an underlying, unappreciated capability. The Thunderbolt had been misjudged. If design gave the P-47 potential, tactics unlocked it. American squadron commanders and pilots learned quickly that the Thunderbolt's strengths demanded a different style of air combat. The old art of the dogfight, turning bleeding energy in a duel of agility, favored the Germans. The new approach would be energy fighting, the so-called boom and zoom, adapted to the Thunderbolt's mass and engine power. Climb to altitude, keep the energy, dive on the enemy with a closed throttle, high-speed pass. Fire, then use the dive's momentum to climb back to safety. The Thunderbolt's mass allowed it to dive faster and retain stability at speeds where lighter fighters encountered control issues. Its 8 guns could shred an aircraft in seconds if deflection and shooting angles were calculated correctly. Pilots like Hubert Zemke and Robert Johnson learned to use the P-47 as a kinetic weapon. Gravity, speed, and sustained fire replaced finesse. The tactical shift was not purely American improvisation. It was forced by experience. After costly early missions, squadron leaders codified new doctrine. Avoid turning fights. Use altitude as a resource. Attack in pairs and flights that could maintain mutual support. The result was a sudden improvement in survivability and effectiveness. The Germans found that their traditional intercepts, bouncing from the sun, diving with initial speed advantage, were less decisive when faced with disciplined energy tactics and an aircraft that ignored a great deal of damage. One encounter stands out as emblematic. On June 26, 1943, an escort mission would demonstrate both the Thunderbolt's fragility in some regimes and its unprecedented toughness. A large formation of P-47s was ambushed by experienced FW-190s. A Thunderbolt at the rear, flown by a young pilot, absorbed near-catastrophic damage. Cannons shredded the canopy and set fires. Controls were impaired, yet the aircraft did not come apart. The pilot, wounded, kept the aircraft controlled and limped back toward England. A German FW-190 circled the crippled P-47, firing until empty, then left in disbelief. The aircraft landed with hundreds of holes counted later by ground crews. That single return sent ripples through both air forces. The Thunderbolt could be killed, but often not easily. April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above the fields of northern France, an uneasy quiet hung beneath the blue. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A-5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermann watched unfamiliar silhouettes laboring upward, their forms slow and broad against the sky. The men in the German cockpits laughed. What else could they do? The new American fighter looked ungainly, a barrel-shaped mass with a greenhouse cockpit and a propeller that seemed too large for the airframe. Flying milk bottles, one pilot radioed. A joke, an insult, a dismissal. What none of them could know that morning was that they had seen, for the first time, a machine that would change the shape of Allied air power. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, loud, and at first dismissed, would become one of the most effective, durable, and destructive fighters of the Second World War. It would not win through elegance or nimbleness. It would win through power, protection, and production. This is the story of how industry became a weapon, and of how a flying juggernaut taught the world that numbers, logistics, and rugged engineering could decide the skies. The Thunderbolt story begins in the worst days of 1940. As German panzer columns and Luftwaffe formations swept across France, American aircraft designers watched and learned. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, received an urgent brief from the U.S. Army Air Corps: build a high-altitude interceptor that could meet the Luftwaffe's best. Kartveli's answer was not to produce a European-style light fighter optimized for climb and turn. He proposed something bigger: a heavy, powerful single-engine fighter built around the most advanced radial available, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. The XP-47B prototype first rose from the runway on May 6, 1941. It startled onlookers. With an empty weight near 9,900 pounds, it was far heavier than previous American single-engine designs. Its fuselage housed a massive turbocharger system whose ducting ran through the rear of the aircraft. It looked and sounded like an oddity. Pilots asked the same question: does this thing actually fly? It did more than fly. At altitude, the turbocharged R-2800 delivered sea-level power where other engines stuttered. The Thunderbolts designers had created an aircraft that traded agility for speed, survivability, and firepower. They built an armor-bolstered structure and a battery of 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. This was not a boutique fighter for racing dogfights. It was an industrial tool designed to survive and to inflict damage. Early testing revealed real problems. The P-47 was unforgiving on takeoff and landing. Its torque and mass caused ground handling accidents. Compressibility, shock effects at high speed, surprised pilots. Many died learning the aircraft. The Thunderbolt killed more American pilots in training through late 1942 than the Luftwaffe would claim in the first months of American combat. Yet those who mastered the machine discovered its hidden logic. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma, likened his first flight to strapping onto a locomotive. "You didn't fly it so much as aim it," he later said. The airplane rewarded energy tactics, diving and using momentum rather than tight turns. And crucially, its radial engine and heavy structure offered survivability unseen in liquid-cooled fighters. The P-47's survival was not accidental. Engineers and production choices built robustness into the airplane. Heavy wing spars, redundant control cables, armor plating behind the pilot, and a layout that protected vital systems all contributed to a remarkable damage tolerance. The radial engine, though large and thirsty, lacked the cooling vulnerabilities of liquid-cooled engines. No single burst could easily disable it, and many hits that would have blown coolant lines in other fighters simply left the Thunderbolt running. Its armament required equally careful engineering. 8 heavy machine guns demanded reliable feeds, heating to prevent freezing at altitude, and power for the electric drives that worked the ammunition belts. Republic built redundancy into the ammunition systems to reduce jamming risk. The result: a plane that, when in attack, could give out torrents of lead with minimal interruption. The psychological effect of witnessing survivors who should have been lost was profound. For American crews, it was confidence. For the Germans, it became a slow dread. Returning pilots and ground crews began to tell tales of aircraft that should not have reached friendly airfields, miracle returns that were in reality the result of purposeful over-engineering. If the P-47's design was a technical answer, its true power lay in the industrial ecosystem that produced, supplied, and maintained it. Republic Aviation expanded rapidly. Factories in Farmingdale, New York, and an enormous new plant in Evansville, Indiana, choked supply lines with Thunderbolts. By 1944, production rates reached staggering levels. At peak, 1 P-47 every hour from selected lines. Production was not only about airframes. Engines rolled off Pratt & Whitney lines in numbers Germany could not match. Ammunition plants, such as Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, produced tens of millions of rounds per month. The logistics of fuel, spare parts, and trained mechanics created an invisible weapon supply. Where the Luftwaffe had brilliant, veteran pilots and specialist manufacturing, the Americans had mass. Where Germany saw craftsmanship, the United States saw scalable standardization. This industrial advantage manifested directly in operations. Airfields could be resupplied rapidly with replacement aircraft. Repair units could return patched frames to the line. When Luftwaffe operations struck Allied airfields in surprise raids, a few days' downtime would not cripple the force. Replacements and depot stocks flowed in. The result was attrition not just in iron, but in people. Germany could not replace experienced pilots at the pace American industry and training sustained new generations of airmen. The American pilot training pipeline itself became part of the systemic advantage. By 1944, the United States graduated tens of thousands of aviators, many with hundreds of hours of flight training before entering combat. This depth of training, combined with mass production, meant that combat losses could be replaced more readily than in the German system, where advanced training had to be sacrificed as the war progressed. One frequent critique of the early Thunderbolt was its range. The initial P-47C entered combat with limited endurance, constraining it from being a full-time deep escort for heavy bombers. Engineers and combat planners responded with practical solutions. Drop tanks extended reach, modifications to the airframe, and production of the P-47D introduced aerodynamic refinements and improved power plants that slightly changed performance profiles. Most transformative was the adoption of paddle blade propellers and later refinements that increased climb and acceleration. The D series with increased fuel capacity and eventually the P-47N variant for the Pacific, which added wet wings and greater internal fuel, showed the airframe's adaptability. With these changes, the Thunderbolt moved from a theater-limited escort to a plane that could stand over bomber streams and reach far into Axis territory. Even as the P-51 Mustang took over long-range escort duties because of its superior range and high-altitude performance, the P-47 found new life in ground attack and close support. Its ruggedness and load-carrying capability made it ideal for the destructive, low-level work that would become critical from 1944 onward. The P-47's evolution into a ground attack workhorse became a defining chapter of its wartime service. With bombs, rocket rails, and its heavy gun battery, the Thunderbolt became an aerial instrument of economic destruction. In the run-up to D-Day and during the Normandy campaign, P-47 units flew an unrelenting stream of sorties against transport columns, rail yards, and armor concentrations. The aircraft's firepower was devastating against soft and lightly armored targets. 2-second bursts of concentrated .50 caliber fire could punch through vehicle tops, ignite fuel, and shred convoys. Rockets, a late-war innovation in air-to-ground armament, added high explosive power that turned the Thunderbolt into a flying artillery piece. 4 German ground formations caught in daylight movement. The presence of P-47s imposed an onerous constraint: travel only by night, disperse columns, and accept the cost in mobility. The statistics from the summer of 1944 are staggering. P-47 units claimed the destruction of thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of trucks, and hundreds of armored vehicles. Whether every claim holds exactly in terms of post-war scholarship is less important than the operational effect. The Wehrmacht's ability to move material, fuel, and reinforcements was severely degraded. Tactical mobility became strategically costly. Close air support for advancing Allied armies, the mortar and artillery of the air, became the Thunderbolt's headline role in the final year of the European campaign. Pilots learned to place ordnance precisely, to suppress artillery points, and to break up counterattack formations with combined rocket and machine gun strikes. Ground troops quickly learned to value the sight and sound of the jug. For them, it meant shelter from enemy fire and dangerous mobility for the attackers. Though often associated with the European theater, the Thunderbolt served everywhere Allied air power needed a tough, armored, and versatile fighter. In Italy and the Mediterranean, the P-47 confronted Axis air power in difficult terrain and weather, supporting ground advances and interdicting supply lines. In the Pacific, the P-47N, a specially configured long-range Thunderbolt, found one of its most demanding roles, escorting long-range bomber operations and striking island defenses. Its rugged engine, ease of maintenance in austere environments, and ability to carry heavy loads made it well-suited to jungle and island operations where runway conditions were rough and supply chains long. Across theaters, the P-47 developed a reputation among enemy airmen as the Jug, or the flying tank. Japanese and German reports alike described a blend of overwhelming firepower and unmatched durability. Where other fighters might be shot into the sea, A Thunderbolt sometimes returned with entire sections of wing shredded away. The Luftwaffe did not ignore the Thunderbolt. German engineers experimented with tactics, weapons, and upgrades in an effort to blunt the Jug's impact. More armored vehicles and anti-aircraft concentration protected convoys. Modified interception tactics focused on slashing attacks from below, exploiting the P-47's relative weakness in some low-altitude turns. They tried to increase cannon loads on fighters to deliver more energetic hits per shell. These measures had localized success, but they could not alter the fundamental strategic balance. German industry was under strain. Fuel shortages and Allied bombing raids reduced production and training throughput. Where the Luftwaffe once counted on methodical pilot development and concentrated specialist units, attrition and limited replacement pipelines fractured training standards. Experienced pilots were killed and could not be easily replaced. The Thunderbolt's arrival accelerated the Luftwaffe's decline, not because of any single engagement, but because it formed part of a larger system that included Allied manufacturing, logistics, and training. In the theater of war, hardware is only as effective as the system behind it. In that test, the United States had built a far stronger machine. Late in the war, German technological leaps produced the first operational jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262 chief among them. In theory, jets outran propeller fighters at every speed band. In practice, jets were vulnerable in limited operating windows, takeoff and landing, or when slowed for attack. Thunderbolt pilots exploited these vulnerabilities. In several documented cases, P-47s, diving from altitude and converting potential energy into brief high-speed intercepts, managed to engage and destroy jets. These were rare and risky fights, but they underscored the idea that tactical opportunity could sometimes negate technical advantage. By 1945, the Luftwaffe's remaining strength was a patchwork. Fuel and trained personnel shortages grounded many aircraft. When large-scale sorties such as Operation Bodenplatte struck Allied airfields on January 1, 1945, the immediate success was heartbreaking for units hit on the ground, but the Allies' industrial depth could reorder resources quickly. Where the Germans lost pilots and squadron leaders irreparably, Allied units replaced aircraft and returned to fight. Momentum favored those who could sustain material and training. By this measure, the P-47 had become part of an ecosystem that Germany could not match. Production numbers alone are revealing. Republic produced more than 15,000 P-47s through the war. Each represented not just a machine, but a node in a vast supply and training network. Airframes, engines, ammunition, and fuel moved across oceans in quantities Germany could not match. The numbers in wartime operational reports convey scale. Thousands of sorties, tens of thousands of ground targets claimed, and a steady stream of replacement aircraft filling squadrons. Equally important were the human elements. American training produced pilots who entered combat with more hours and preparation than their German counterparts late in the war. Mechanics and ground crews learned to keep Thunderbolts flying in high-tempo conditions. The net effect was continuity of force. Loss rates could be absorbed, while German losses accumulated into irrecoverable deficits. Behind the industrial statistics remain human stories. German pilots, once confident and battle-hardened, found themselves facing a different kind of foe. The concentrated firepower of the P-47 did not always make for dramatic single-aircraft duels. Often it made for sudden and devastating bursts of destruction. Aluminum rain, as some described it, that left little chance of escape. For Allied pilots, the Thunderbolt inspired both fear and confidence. Its weight could be a liability in some fights, but in many others it was a lifeline. Men who survived impossible damage owed their lives to the structural choices of designers and the maintenance crews who kept torn aircraft airworthy. The machine thus became a mirror of industrial society. Its existence reflected the broader mobilization of an economy and a population under arms. Like any successful wartime design, the P-47 evolved. The early C and D models gave way to incremental improvements. Paddle blade propellers for better climb and acceleration, improved superchargers, aerodynamic tweaks, and fuel capacity extensions. The P-47N variant embodied the Pacific theater's needs, with extended range and structural enhancements for long missions. Specialized variants targeted specific threats. The P-47M introduced higher power engines and refinements to intercept high-speed threats, including early German jets and V-1 flying bombs. The widespread adoption of rockets and heavier bomb loads converted the Thunderbolt into a multi-role platform, an evolution from short-range interceptor to true fighter bomber. If any date symbolizes the P-47's transformation into a strategic weapon, it is June 6, 1944. On D-Day, hundreds of Thunderbolts provided overhead cover for the invasion forces, patrolling from sea level to tens of thousands of feet, interdicting German reinforcements, and providing close support to ground troops. Allied air dominance on that day was not the work of a single aircraft type, but the P-47's contribution was central, rugged, reliable, and lethal at low altitude in support missions. German attempts to break the air umbrella failed in part because the Thunderbolt units operated as a system. Fighter escorts, reconnaissance, interdiction, and ground attack all coordinated to keep the beaches supplied and the Germans off balance. In the days and weeks that followed, Allied air power, with P-47s integrated at nearly every level, denied the Wehrmacht the mobility needed to repulse the invasion. In the closing months of the war, the P-47 continued to hammer supply lines, rail junctions, and retreating formations. Pilots flew at a tempo that strained crews and machines. Maintenance and logistics crews strained to keep pace. The effect became cumulative. Transportation nodes collapsed under repeated strikes. Frontline units found resupply perilous. The German ability to concentrate armored forces or launch timely counterattacks dwindled. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Experienced instructors and squadron leaders were lost, fuel was scarce, and production lines were under attack from Allied bombing. The P-47 had not achieved this outcome alone, but it had been a major and consistent contributor to the systemic pressures that made effective German resistance impossible. After hostilities ceased, the P-47 left a legacy beyond kill ratios and production figures. For pilots, it was remembered as a machine that protected you when everything else failed. Its survivability inspired generations of designers and influenced the development of rugged, multi-role fighters in the jet age. Museums preserve Thunderbolts as reminders of an industrial war machine, not the glamorous acrobat, but the dependable hammered. At memorials and reunions, former adversaries spoke of the Thunderbolt with an unusual reverence. Some German pilots admitted their early scorn and later humility. "We laughed at them in 1943, one veteran would say years after the war. "We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to be elegant. They just needed to be everywhere and to keep coming." The P-47 story is a lesson in systems thinking, aircraft design, tactics, production capacity, logistics, and training combined to determine combat power. The Thunderbolt's true victory was to expose a truth of modern war. That orientation toward production, standardized training, and robust engineering can trump technical finesse in the crucible of prolonged conflict. The Thunderbolt began as a controversial design born from panic and ambition. It was heavy, dangerous in the hands of the unprepared, and at times inefficient. Yet it evolved into something far greater than the sum of its parts. In the skies over Europe and the Pacific, it became a reliable instrument of Allied strategy. It protected bombers, tore supply chains apart, and supported ground forces with a violence that made the phrase "flying tank" apartment. It helped reduce the Wehrmacht's operational freedom and contributed materially to the Allies' ability to sustain continuous pressure. In the end, what the P-47 represents is not simply an aircraft, but an approach to war: industrial depth, tactical adaptation, and the will to translate complex engineering into operational effect. The Jug's roar was not merely noise. It was the sound of an economy mobilized, of factories humming, of pilots trained, and of a logistical system capable of turning steel and fuel into decisive power. When you think back to that April morning in 1943, beyond the smirks and dismissals, you can see a different image, not a joke, but a prototype of a new kind of warfare. The Thunderbolt did not shy from the brutality of that conflict. It accepted punishment, delivered it in return, and in so doing helped to rewrite the balance of aerial power. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, ugly to the eye, fearsome in the sky, and decisive in consequence, stands as a testament to the era that built it, an era that understood that in total war, industry itself must become a weapon.